Hey everybody, welcome back. Today I'm going to take a look at the Valoi Easy35 camera scanning system. I got back into film photography almost 10 years ago now. At the time I would get lab scans back. I wasn't super happy with them. I wasn't happy with the detail. I wasn't happy with how contrasty they ended up being, blowing out the highlights, crushing the shadows. And I tried a few different labs at the time and I wasn't super happy with the results. But also I wanted to take sort of creative control over my scans. Around that time, I picked up an Epson V800 flatbed scanner. And for almost 10 years now, I've been scanning all of my film, 35mm and 120 film, in the Epson flatbed. For the longest time, I've used Silverfast to scan and do a basic color correction on my negatives. Over the course of the last couple of months, I've actually transitioned into using Negative Lab Pro. I found the idea of having sort of a raw negative that you can non-destructively edit, that those edits are not baked into the file, really appealing. For the longest time, ever since getting into 120 film, I kind of saw 35mm as sort of less than in a lot of ways. Primarily because I was really unhappy with the scans that I would get on my flatbed scanner with the 35mm negative. It being so much smaller and softer and lower detail. It was really sort of beyond the limits of a flatbed scanner to get a really good high resolution file that you can print larger than say 8x10. In the intervening time, I heard about camera scanning where you use a DSLR or a mirrorless camera and a macro lens to take a photo of your negatives and then invert them after the fact. It was really appealing to me, but there was a lot of setup that's involved, getting a copy stand, a light source, ensuring that the film and your camera sensor are parallel, something to hold the film and keep it flat while you're scanning. So it's a lot of these little pieces. I kind of wanted to jump in without making that investment in all that equipment. So I heard about the Valoi Easy35, and just a full disclosure, they did send me this unit to test and review for YouTube. They didn't give me any sort of stipulations as to what I should say or any restrictions. This is my entirely unbiased review. So let's take a look at it. I'll show you some scans that I've done with my flatbed versus with the Valoi Easy35, talk to you about the process of setting it up, and give you an idea of what I think. Is this something that makes sense for those of you that might be in the same boat that have been using a flatbed scanner, or maybe you're getting into film photography from the very beginning and getting into scanning from the very beginning? Is this a way to jump right into it? So let's take a look. I opted to use the Nikon D800. With its still relevant 36 megapixel sensor, it's more than capable of capturing all the inherent detail in a 35mm negative. I paired the D800 with the Nikon 60mm f2.8D macro lens. This can be had for a great price on the used market and works with both my D800 and my f3 film body. You can use a self-timer to minimize camera shake, but I prefer a remote cable release since the self-timer introduces an additional delay for each scanned frame. The Valoi Easy35 is ridiculously simple to set up. They include a handy guide to walk you through the process, but it's pretty self-explanatory. Included in the kit are the film holder, light unit itself, the Valoi Easy35, a series of extension tubes to achieve the correct film to camera sensor distance to fill the frame, a series of step-up and down rings to adapt the extension tubes to your lens. If your chosen lens has a 62mm filter thread like mine does, you don't need to use any of these. Additionally, I tested the optional 35mm sprocket holder and duster add-on. To get started, you can use the guide to get an idea of how many extension tubes and what sort you'll need for your chosen sensor size and focal length. Once you figure that out, attach the tubes to the Easy35, then screw the whole assembly onto the end of your lens. Then, set the kit flat on a table, loosen the thumb screw to align the Easy35 so it's level with the camera sensor, and tighten it once more. There are two adjustment wheels on the end of the light unit, one to turn it on and adjust the intensity of the light, and the other to adjust the color temperature. Valoi recommends the coolest setting for color negative film to counteract the orange mask, and the warmest setting for slide film, and somewhere in the middle for black and white. I leave the intensity all the way up so I can use as fast a shutter speed as possible. In terms of camera settings, I leave the white balance on auto since I'm shooting raw and I'll be adjusting that later. I'm shooting in aperture priority mode with the aperture set to the sharpest setting for my lens, with enough depth of field to ensure most of the frame is in focus. In the case of my lens, I'm using f8. The ISO is set to my camera's lowest native setting, 100 in this case. As recommended by Valoi, I'm adding one stop of exposure compensation for negative film to make sure I'm capturing enough detail through the emulsion. For slide film, it's best to use your camera's histogram in live view to find the best exposure without blowing out the highlights. That will vary from frame to frame. Now we're ready to scan. Simply insert the negative strip or roll into the opening on the right and push the film until the frame lines up. Zoom in to manually focus on the grain and press the shutter. Advance the film and repeat the process. I usually recheck focus every 10 or so frames and on the final frame to ensure the focus hasn't shifted. Using this process, I can scan a whole roll in 2 to 3 minutes, around a 20th of the time it takes to do so on my flatbed at a comparable resolution. Let's take a look at some of the scans and do a quick comparison to my Epson V800 flatbed. On the flatbed, I'm scanning them in as 48-bit HDRI RAW positives at 4800 DPI. This is Fuji Xperia 400. On the left here, we have the camera scan. We're using the Easy35, and on the right, we have the flatbed scan. Now, these have been processed the same way with almost identical settings in Negative Lab Pro. And just off the bat, without going into further detail, I noticed that the camera scan has much richer, more vibrant colors. There's better color separation just off the bat without going in and boosting the saturation or making any other adjustments beyond sort of the baseline adjustments I would do in Negative Lab Pro. If we take a 100% view of this, this is where the differences really become stark. Looking at the camera scan here on the left, there is so much more detail. The blades of grass, the leaves in these bushes here, the reflection in the water. It stands out so much better right off the bat. This is with just the baseline sharpening out of Negative Lab Pro. I haven't done any additional corrections. Now on the right-hand side is the flatbed scan, and this I've boosted the sharpening well beyond what Negative Lab Pro defaults are. And in fact, if I wanted to get this closer to the camera scan, I would need to boost sharpening all the way to its max, increase the radius, and it becomes a little crunchy at that point. But as you can see right out of the gate, the camera scan on the left, much more detail, much more vibrant color without making any additional corrections in post. Now let's take a look at some black and white film. This is Ilford HP5. It's a 400 speed film, kind of a medium speed, medium grain film. This has actually been pushed, I believe, to 1600, so it's going to be a little bit grainier than a normal 400 ISO film would be. But this is going to give us a really good example of how camera scanning represents grain versus flatbed scanning. But also just looking at the two images side by side right now, I see a little bit more like subtle gradations between the lights and the darks here on the camera scan on the left. But that's kind of a little bit more of a subtle difference between the two. And you can achieve parity by making some edits in Negative Lab Pro. But let's zoom in. So we zoom into 100%, and the first thing we notice on the left, obviously it is far grainier, and that's because we've actually captured the grain that's there. With the baseline sharpening settings in Negative Lab Pro, the grain and the detail are clear as day, and I think actually quite beautiful. Now on the right-hand side, you see the flatbed scan where the grain is like sort of soft and diffuse, and fine details have been lost. Now these are similar resolution scans. I could go in and boost the hell out of the sharpening with the flatbed scan and get some of that detail back. But again, that's additional post-processing and you're still losing some semblance of the detail. When you sharpen it that much, you end up getting halos around light and dark contrasting regions. So just at the detail, the grain representation and reproduction, the camera scan, in my opinion, wins out here. Okay, next we're going to take a look at some Kodak Gold 200. Now, on the left here, we have the camera scan with the Easy35. On the right, we have the flatbed scan. Now, these both have nearly identical settings in Negative Lab Pro, including sharpening. So just off the bat, here on the left-hand side, the camera scan, to my eyes, has much more vibrant color, particularly in the reds. And that's something that really stands out to me. Now, I have been able to, in post, go back and boost the saturation of the flatbed scan here on the right to get it a little bit closer. The camera scan has colors that are much more vibrant, contrast that's better, without making any additional adjustments. Now, and again, I'm going to zoom into 100% and just looking at the detailed difference between the two, even though they're of similar resolutions. We are resolving all of the grain here of the Kodak Gold 200, and we're getting such more fine detail. Look at this rose here on the left versus the right. Look at how the text is represented, the contrast between the lights and the darks here on the left versus the right. So you're getting a lot more detail, and you are exaggerating the grain just a little bit because it is a 35mm negative. There is grain. It's not a professional film, so there will be grain. But that is something we're trying to represent, we're trying to reproduce. So in my eyes, the camera scan wins hands down between these two. All right, the last thing we're going to take a look at is one of the biggest surprises to me is looking at slide film. Now, whenever I've scanned slide film with my flatbed scanner, I've always been so disappointed. There's so much more color and vibrancy, and they're so beautiful on that light table. And then I scan them and they end up being flat and dull and sort of muddy. And I just thought that was the way scans turned out. But after doing some camera scans of my slide film, particularly this is one of my favorite images I've taken on Fuji Velvia 50. On the left, we have the camera scan, and on the right, we have the flatbed scan. This is barring most adjustments, so this is pretty close directly out of the scan. So looking at these two images, a few things that stand out to me. We are picking up a lot more detail in the sky, which it's a little bit blown out on the right. We can adjust the exposure to bring those back into parity, but right from the get-go, it's already kind of a little bit washed out in the flatbed scan. The sky is taken on kind of like a deeper, more purple hue in the right-hand side in the flatbed scan versus the camera scan on the left. Whereas on the left here, this is what the slide looks like on a light table. So, you know, without very many adjustments, those slides are coming out much closer to what they look in real life than the flatbed scan. So that's just pure color rendition and dynamic range. But zooming in here, looking at the detail of the camera scan versus the flatbed scan, again, the camera scan's on the left. I mean, right out of the gate, baseline sharpening, there is so much more detail that's being resolved in this Fuji Velvia 50 slide than in the flatbed scan. And it is a very sharp film. It is a very low grain film. So all of those details are captured perfectly in the camera scan with the Easy35 versus the flatbed scan on the right. I'll talk briefly about a couple of the accessories I tested along with the Valoi Easy35. The duster brush add-on can be quickly attached via a couple of thumb screws. This helps to remove dust and particles that may have settled on your film while preventing more dust from accumulating during the scan. It was hard to tell if this made a huge difference, but anything you can do to avoid more work cleaning up dust in post, the better. The 35mm sprocket holder allows you to include sprocket holes and film borders in your scans. This is a novelty for me and isn't worth losing the resolution in my opinion, but it'd be great if you're using a camera that exposes all the way to the film edges. What do I think of the Easy35? I'm addicted, I'm hooked. As someone that's been doing flatbed scanning for many, many years, using the Easy35, it's compact, it's really easy to set up. You don't need like a bespoke space in your work area to scan your film. You just pop it on the end of your macro lens and you are ready to scan your film. It's really, really quick. I've gone through my vault and rescan things just out of fun. Even for this review, I ended up pulling out a lot of negatives I haven't looked at in many years. Are there other ways to accomplish camera scanning? Absolutely. Could you find a way to do it cheaper? Sure. But I think the Easy35 encompasses simple to use, very effective, very high quality light source. It's been extremely fun using the Easy35, and if they hadn't sent me one, I would buy it with my own money. And that's maybe the highest recommendation that I can give. At the time being, they are working on an Easy120, which I think that's going to be maybe a little bit more of a complicated product. I'm very interested in scanning 120 this same way. For the time being, for 35mm, especially if you're kind of focusing on that, this is an amazing product. I really like it, and it does come highly recommended. So I hope this has been helpful in some way. If you have any questions, please feel free to throw them down in the comments. If you want to know more about this product, or you want to tell me what you're using, your scan setup, I would love to hear about it. I always like to compare. But other than that, thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.